The air in the first-grade classroom tasted like gasoline and fear. 154 children and teachers pressed together in a space meant for 30. Their eyes fixed on the shopping cart in the center of the room, where wires snaked from a milk jug filled with fuel and a clothespin held death at bay. David Young's hand never left the string tied to his wrist, the one that connected to the trigger, and his eyes held nothing but emptiness, a void where mercy should have lived. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the afternoon on May 16, 1986, each second stretching into eternity as the children tried to stay quiet, tried to breathe through the fumes, tried not to cry. Outside the windows, the spring sunshine of Cokeville, Wyoming seemed to belong to another world entirely, a world where mothers waited at home and fathers worked in peace, where school was supposed to be the safest place a child could be. The teachers whispered prayers under their breath and tried to keep the children calm, telling stories, singing quiet songs, anything to distract from the armed man pacing the perimeter of the room and the bomb that could detonate at any moment. Some of the children had already started feeling sick from the fumes, their small faces pale and confused, unable to comprehend why their Friday afternoon had turned into a nightmare. The masking tape on the floor marked out a square magic square. Young called it that the children were forbidden to cross, keeping them huddled in one corner while he stood guard over his device of destruction. When he finally agreed to let the teachers open the windows and doors for air, it felt like a small mercy in an ocean of terror, but everyone knew the danger remained, coiled and waiting like a snake ready to strike. Then David Young walked into the bathroom, handing the trigger string to his wife Doris, and in that moment, the weight of 154 lives hung from a clothespin and a piece of string on a woman's wrist. She stood there in the center of the room, surrounded by the innocent faces she and her husband had threatened, the gasoline fumes making her head pound with pain. Without thinking, without meaning to, she raised her hand to her forehead to soothe the ache, and the string pulled taut, and the world exploded into fire and smoke, and the screaming of children who thought they were about to die. The blast should have killed them, or the bomb squad would later say it should have leveled the entire building, but instead, something impossible happened in that classroom. Something that would take years for the children to fully understand, and even longer for the skeptics to explain away. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The town of Cokeville was the kind of place where people believed in safety and trust, and the goodness of their neighbors. 500 souls lived there, nestled in Lincoln County on the border between Wyoming and Idaho, where the mountains rose like guardians and the air tasted clean and pure. The elementary school stood at the heart of the community, a place where children learned their letters and numbers, where teachers knew every student by name, where the biggest concern on most days was whether to serve chocolate or plain milk at lunch. Hart and Judy in Wixom had raised their children there, believing, as most parents did, that Cokeville represented everything good about small town America, the kind of place where youngsters grew up knowing they could turn to any adult with confidence, where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors looked after one another's kids. The school itself was modest, but well-loved, filled with the artwork of students and the dedication of teachers who saw education as a calling rather than just a job. On the morning of May 16th, no one could have imagined that their peaceful town would become the site of what could have been the worst school disaster in American history. The children arrived at school that Friday morning with backpacks and lunchboxes, excited about the weekend ahead, about playing outside in the spring sunshine, about the ordinary joys of childhood that they took for granted because they had never known real fear. The teachers prepared their lessons, the secretary answered phones in the office, the principal walked the halls, checking on his students, and everything felt normal and safe and exactly as it should be. But in Arizona, a former town marshal named David Young was loading a homemade bomb into a van, along with 5 rifles and 5 handguns, his mind consumed by a twisted philosophy he called zero equals infinity, and a plan to hold the children of Cokeville hostage for $2 million per child. He had chosen Cokeville deliberately, knowing from his time as the town marshal that it was a close-knit community where threatening one meant threatening all, where the bonds of trust ran deep, and could be exploited. He had tested his bomb on a school bus in the Arizona desert, watching it explode with satisfaction. Perfecting the mechanism that he now wore, strapped to his wrist, like a watch, counting down to Judgment Day. His wife Doris, who had married him despite the warning signs of his instability, rode beside him in the van, along with his daughter Princess from his first marriage, who was beginning to realize that her father's plan was not the adventure he had promised, but something dark and evil that she wanted no part of. When they pulled up to Cokeville Elementary at 1 o'clock that afternoon, just after lunch recess, the children were settling back into their classrooms. The teachers were starting afternoon lessons, and no one noticed the van in the parking lot until David Young walked through the front door with a grocery cart full of death. Secretary Tina Cook was the first to see him. The first to look into those empty eyes and hear him say the words that would shatter the afternoon's peace. "This is a revolution." He forced her to unplug the phones, cutting off the school's connection to the outside world, and then he moved through the hallways with Doris at his side, rounding up teachers and students with the efficiency of someone who had planned every detail. Doris went from classroom to classroom, telling the children there was a surprise waiting, an assembly they needed to attend, her voice calm and reassuring, even as she carried weapons and knew what was coming. The children followed her trustingly, excited about the promised surprise, their small feet padding down the hallway toward the first-grade classroom where their world would change forever. By the time everyone was herded into that single room, 136 children and 18 adults stood packed together, confused and frightened as David Young announced his demands and showed them the bomb that would kill them all if anyone tried to be a hero. Hours that followed felt like an eternity, compressed into moments of terror, punctuated by small acts of courage. The teachers' women, like Janelle Dayton, Carol Peterson, and Cliss Sparksby, became the anchors that kept the children from dissolving into complete panic. Their voices steady, even as their hearts raced with fear. Their minds calculating how to keep their students safe while a madman held them hostage. They organized the children into groups, led them in quiet songs, whispered reassurances that help would come, all while the fumes from the gasoline grew stronger and the children began to feel sick and dizzy. David Young paced the perimeter of his magic square, his manifesto clutched in one hand and the trigger string wound around the other, preaching his philosophy about intelligence and evolution and the new world order he planned to create with his ransom money. Some of the children were too young to understand what was happening, seeing it as a strange game that wasn't fun anymore, while the older students grasped enough to be truly afraid, their eyes wide and their bodies tense with the effort of staying still and quiet. The gasoline fumes grew thicker, making everyone's eyes water and their throats burn. And finally, the teachers convinced Young to let them open the windows and doors to let in fresh air. It was a small victory that might have saved lives even before the bomb went off, a moment of humanity breaking through the madness. But everyone knew that danger remained as present as the ticking of the clock on the wall. Parents began to gather outside the school as word spread through the tiny town, their faces pressed against the police barriers, their prayers rising like smoke into the clear Wyoming sky. Ron Hartley, the deputy whose own children were inside that classroom, drove back to Cokeville at speeds that nearly destroyed his patrol car, his mind filled with images of what he might find, his faith in God wavering with every mile that brought him closer to the school. Inside the classroom, the children had begun to pray, some silently, some in whispered circles, some calling out to God in the simple, direct way that only children can, asking Him to keep them safe, to let them see their mothers and fathers again, to make the bad man go away. 2.5 hours into the standoff, David Young's agitation had grown into something volatile and unpredictable, his pacing more frantic, his grip on reality seeming to slip with every passing minute. He announced he needed to use the bathroom, the small room that connected the first and second grade classrooms, and in that moment he made a decision that would seal his fate and somehow, impossibly, save every single hostage in that room. He transferred the trigger mechanism to Doris's wrist, winding the string around her arm and telling her to hold very still, to not let go no matter what, because if the clothespin closed and the circuit completed, The bomb would detonate with a force of 25 sticks of dynamite. Doris stood there in the center of the room, surrounded by children who had started to see her not just as their captor, but as another human being who sang songs and showed them small kindnesses despite the horror of the situation. The headache that had been building from the gasoline fumes pounded behind her eyes, making it hard to think, hard to focus on anything except the pain that seemed to split her skull in two. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct to soothe the agony in her head, Doris raised her hand to her forehead, and the string pulled tight, and the clothespin snapped closed. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic, a wall of fire and smoke that filled the room in an instant. The gasoline igniting in a fireball that should have incinerated everyone in its path. Metal shrapnel from the tuna cans filled with aluminum powder and flour shot through the air like bullets. The ammunition stored in the shopping cart began exploding from the heat, and the windows blew out in a shower of glass that rained down on the grass outside, where parents screamed and tried to break through the police lines. But something impossible happened in that moment of destruction. The blast that should have spread outward and killed everyone in the room instead went straight up, punching a hole through the ceiling, as if directed by an invisible hand. The children closest to the bomb should have been killed instantly, their small bodies no match for the force of the explosion. But instead, they found themselves being pulled, pushed, guided toward the windows and doors by hands they couldn't always see, and voices they couldn't always hear. The teachers moved with a speed and certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond themselves, grabbing children and shoving them through the open windows, through the doorways, into the hallway where the air was clearer and the fire couldn't reach them. Janelle Dayton, the first-grade teacher, would later say she felt as if she were being lifted, carried, given strength she didn't possess on her own to get her students out of the burning room. Some of the children described seeing people in the room with them, people dressed in white who stood between them and the fire, who told them which way to run, who held their hands and led them to safety through the smoke and flames. One little girl saw a woman dressed in white who told her to stand by the window with her brother, that everything would be okay, and when she did as instructed, she found herself pushed through the opening to safety. Katie Walker saw bright figures standing in a circle around the bomb, holding hands like a protective barrier between the children and the explosion, and when the blast came, she watched them rise up through the ceiling, taking the force of the fire with them. David Young emerged from the bathroom to find his wife engulfed in flames, her body burned beyond recognition. The room filled with smoke and chaos and children escaping through every opening they could find. He raised his gun and shot her, perhaps as an act of mercy or perhaps in rage at the failure of his plan. And then he shot John Miller, a music teacher who was helping children escape. He retreated back into the bathroom and put the gun to his own head, pulling the trigger and ending his life before anyone could stop him, leaving behind nothing but questions about what had driven him to such madness and how his plan had failed so completely. Within minutes, the room was empty of living children. All 154 hostages. Evacuated through a combination of teacher heroics and what many would come to believe was divine intervention. 79 people were treated for burns and smoke inhalation, some with injuries severe enough to require hospitalization in Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, but not a single hostage died in the explosion that should have killed them all. The aftermath of the Cokeville bombing rippled through the community like waves spreading from a stone thrown into still water, touching everyone, changing everything, leaving nothing as it had been before. Parents reunited with their children on the grass outside the school, holding them tight and weeping with relief and terror at how close they had come to losing them. Unable to let go, even as emergency workers tried to assess injuries and arrange transport to hospitals. The burned children were triaged and sent to multiple medical facilities, their injuries ranging from minor smoke inhalation to severe second-degree burns that would require weeks of treatment and leave scars that would last a lifetime. But they were alive, every single one of them. And that fact alone seemed to defy explanation. The bomb squad experts who examined the remains of the device said it should have destroyed the entire building, that the concentration of flammable material in such a confined space should have created a fireball that no one could have survived. Rich Haskell, the certified bomb technician who raced to the scene from Rock Springs, driving so fast he burned out his patrol car's engine in his desperation to get there, examined the evidence with the eye of a professional and the heart of a man who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The blast pattern made no sense. The explosion had gone straight up instead of outward, punching a hole through the ceiling and roof as if the force had been channeled in a single direction, leaving the walls standing and creating a path for the children to escape through windows that should have been destroyed. The shrapnel that should have torn through soft flesh at chest and head level was instead embedded in the ceiling and walls above the children's height, as if something had deflected the trajectory of every piece of metal. The ammunition that had exploded in the heat should have turned the room into a killing zone, but the bullets seemed to have fired in random directions that somehow missed all the fleeing children. In the days and weeks that followed, as the physical wounds began to heal and the children returned to school in a different building, the stories began to emerge of what had happened inside that classroom during the explosion. At first, the accounts focused on the horror of fear, the smoke, the flames, but gradually, another narrative began to surface, particularly among the children, who spoke of things they had seen and experienced that couldn't be explained by luck or coincidence. Jenny Johnson, who had been a young student that day, searched for the teacher who had led her out of the burning room, asking her grandmother about the woman who had held her hand and told her not to go back for her shoe, not to look back at all, but just to keep moving forward toward safety. Years later, looking through a family photo album, Jenny pointed to a picture and asked when that particular teacher had quit teaching after the bombing, and her grandmother's response changed everything. The woman in the photo was her great-aunt Ruth, who had never been a teacher and who had died several years before the bombing ever happened. Katie Walker's story was similar. She described to her mother the angels she had seen, the bright figures dressed in white who had stood between the children and the bad man, forming a protective circle around the bomb. And when her mother showed her a locket containing a photograph of Katie's grandmother who had died when she was just 15, Katie pointed to the picture and said, "That's her, that's one of the angels." Child after child came forward with stories of deceased ancestors who had appeared to them in the classroom, who had guided them to safety, who had told them everything would be okay, even as fire raged around them. Some saw the figures clearly, could describe their faces and their clothing in detail that matched family photographs they had never seen before. Others simply felt hands pushing them, guiding them, lifting them through windows when their own strength failed, or heard voices telling them which way to run when the smoke was too thick to see through. Not everyone saw angels. Some survivors experienced only terror and confusion, the desperate scramble to escape a burning room while their lungs filled with smoke and their skin blistered from the heat. But enough children and even a few adults reported similar experiences that the pattern became impossible to dismiss as imagination or trauma-induced hallucination. Cameron Wixom, one of the child hostages, would later write about the experience with the simple faith of someone who had never doubted what had saved them that day. He hadn't needed to see angels or hear them to know they were there, hadn't needed proof beyond the fact that he and his classmates had survived something that should have killed them all. The community of Cokeville, predominantly members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but welcoming of all faiths, embraced the narrative of divine intervention, not because they needed to make sense of the tragedy, but because they recognized the truth of what had happened in that classroom, that prayer had been answered, that faith had been rewarded, that something beyond human understanding had reached down and touched the lives of their children. The Cokeville bombing became known as the Cokeville Miracle, documented in books and films and oral histories collected by the Wyoming State Archives, each testimony adding another layer to the story of what happened on May 16, 1980. Hart and Judine Wixom wrote the first comprehensive account, interviewing survivors and families and emergency responders, trying to capture not just the facts of what happened, but the spiritual dimension that so many had experienced. The Cokeville Miracle Foundation compiled additional remembrances, creating a record that would preserve the stories for future generations. ensuring that the miracle wouldn't be forgotten or dismissed as the years passed and memories faded. Filmmaker T.C. Christensen created a movie based on the event, filming on location in Cokeville, with many of the actual survivors and their families participating as extras, adding their presence and their truth to the recreation of the most terrifying day of their lives. The question that haunted some people, the question that those with less faith asked, was why Cokeville and not Columbine? Why these children and not the ones who died in Sandy Hook or Parkland or any of the other schools where tragedy struck without intervention or miracle? But the survivors of Cokeville didn't claim to have the answer to that question, didn't pretend to understand why they had been spared when others hadn't been, didn't diminish other tragedies by suggesting their faith was somehow stronger or more deserving of divine attention. They simply testified to what they had experienced, to the presence they had felt in that burning classroom, to the hands that had guided them and the voices that had comforted them, and they offered their story as evidence that faith matters, that prayer is heard, that love transcends death and reaches back across the veil to protect those who remain. The town learned to live with what had happened, incorporating the miracle into their understanding of who they were and what they believed, healing slowly from the trauma while holding fast to the blessing they had been given. Today, the story of the Cokeville bombing serves as a reminder that truth can be stranger than fiction, that sometimes the impossible becomes possible, that faith and prayer and love can create outcomes that defy all logical explanation. The children who survived that day grew up to become parents themselves, telling their own children about the day angels appeared in their classroom, passing down the testimony of divine intervention from one generation to the next. The teachers who herded their students to safety returned to their calling, knowing they had been part of something larger than themselves, that their courage had been amplified by grace they couldn't claim credit for. The community of Cokeville rebuilt and moved forward, but they never forgot, never stopped believing, never allowed the world to convince them that what they knew to be true was merely coincidence or luck or the random chance of a bomb that malfunctioned in just the right way at just the right time. The evidence remains the blast pattern that makes no sense, the survival of children who stood within feet of a bomb that should have killed them instantly, the testimonies of dozens of people who saw things that cannot be explained by science or reason. The skeptics can analyze the construction of the bomb, can point to the lucky accident of Doris raising her hand prematurely, can suggest that trauma creates false memories and that children's imaginations fill in gaps with stories they've been told. But none of that explains why every single hostage survived, why the fire went up instead of out, why the shrapnel missed vulnerable bodies, why so many children independently described seeing deceased relatives they had never met. The simplest explanation, the one that the survivors themselves offer without hesitation or doubt, is that God heard the prayers of frightened children and desperate parents, that He sent angels to stand between His children and destruction. That faith created a shield no bomb could penetrate. In the quiet town of Cokeville, Wyoming, where the mountains still stand guard and the elementary school still teaches children their letters and numbers, the memory of May 16, 1986 lives on as both a wound and a wonder. A day when evil tried to destroy innocence and instead found itself face to face with something stronger, something eternal, something that burns brighter than any fire and cannot be extinguished by any darkness. The children who survived carry the memory with them always, a reminder that they were held by hands they couldn't always see, that they were loved by those who had gone before, that when they needed rescue most desperately, heaven itself reached down to pull them from the flames. And in the telling and retelling of this story, in the witness of those who were there and those who came after, lives the truth that faith is not simply what we believe, but what we experience when we are broken and desperate. And calling out for help, it is the hand that catches us when we fall, the light that guides us through the darkness, the love that will not let us go. This account is based on actual events, documented by the Wyoming State Archives in their oral history project, Survivor is My Name, which includes testimony from 14 survivors and first responders, The story has been corroborated by multiple sources, including wyohistory.org. The book, The Cokeville Miracle, When Angels Intervene by Hart and Judy, and the book Witness to Miracles, compiled by the Cokeville Miracle Foundation. The 2015 film, The Cokeville Miracle, directed by T.C. Christensen, was based on these documented accounts and filmed with the participation of actual survivors. All names, dates, and core facts have been verified through official records, news reports from 1986, and the sworn testimony of those who experienced this extraordinary day when angels appeared in a classroom to save 154 lives from certain death.